She vanished without a word. And when he finally found her, she was stitching her own wound shut with trembling hands in a freezing, lightless apartment. Damien Vescari, the man an entire city feared, stood frozen in the doorway. Blood on the floor, encrypted drives on the table, and the woman everyone had overlooked was the only reason he was still alive. He just didn't know it yet. If this story already has you hooked, drop your city in the comments and hit that like button. Let's see how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because what happens next will change everything you thought you knew about loyalty, betrayal, and the people hiding in plain sight. The call never came. That was the first thing wrong. Elena Cross sent a confirmation text every morning at 7:42 a.m. without fail. Not because Damien required it, not because it was written into any contract, but because she was Elena, and Elena did not leave things unconfirmed. Schedules, wire transfers, encrypted account summaries delivered to a secured server before the city even finished its first cup of coffee. She had done it for 4 years straight, through hurricanes, through 2 of Damien's hospitalization scares, through the week her mother collapsed and was rushed to St. Augustine Medical, and Elena still sent that 7:42 message before she left for the hospital. So when Damien's phone sat dark at 7:43 on a Tuesday morning, 2 days before his wedding, he felt it before he understood it. A small pull in the chest, like a loose thread catching somewhere deep. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself that for exactly 11 minutes. Then he called Marcus. "Find her," he said. No greeting, no explanation. Marcus, who had been Damien's head of security for 9 years and had learned to read the silence between his boss's words better than most men could read an open book, didn't ask which her. He already knew. There was only one person Damien ever called about without context. "How urgent?" Marcus asked. Damien looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse. The city below was gray and wet, early November pressing down on everything like a bruise. The waterfront, 2 miles south, was barely visible through the rain. "Urgent," Damien said. Then he hung up. He should have been reviewing seating arrangements. He should have been on a call with his attorney, finalizing the merger documents that the wedding was legally designed to support. In 48 hours, he was set to marry Sofia Carano, only daughter of Vincent Carano, patriarch of the Carano Syndicate, who controlled shipping lanes up the entire eastern seaboard that Damien had been trying to access for a decade. The wedding wasn't romantic. Nobody pretended it was. It was architecture. 2 criminal empires pressing their foundations together so neither one cracked under its own weight. That was the plan, anyway. Marcus called back in 22 minutes. His voice was flat in that particular way it got when the information he was delivering was the kind that changed the temperature of a room. "She's not at her apartment. Landlord says he hasn't seen her since Sunday evening. No answer at the door. Her car's still in the lot." A pause. "Damien, her phone is off." Elena Cross did not turn her phone off. Ever. She slept with it charging 4 inches from her face in case something needed handling at 3 in the morning. Damien had joked about it once, the only time he could remember genuinely laughing with her, telling her that even machines needed rest. She had looked at him with those serious dark eyes and said, without blinking, "The machines don't run my accounts." He'd walked away from that conversation thinking she was strange. Now he was standing in his bedroom closet, pulling a matte black jacket off a hanger and thinking he'd never actually looked at her at all. "I'm going myself," he said. "That's across the Veretti line." Marcus's voice sharpened. "Damien, 2 days before the wedding. If Carano's people see you in Eastside without notice, then they'll see me in Eastside." He checked the weight of the firearm at his hip out of habit, the way some men check their watch. "You're driving." The Veretti line was an invisible boundary that ran along the industrial stretch of Crane Boulevard, separating the eastern neighborhoods, older, poorer, crumbling brick and exhaust fumes, from the western districts that Damien's organization controlled. Crossing it without warning was a declaration, not of war, not exactly, but of disrespect, of territory ignored. The Cabretti family held Eastside, and while they weren't enemies, they weren't friends. And they were absolutely the type to notice a black SUV rolling slow through their streets 2 days before a political wedding. Damien didn't care. The drive took 14 minutes through rain that had gone from drizzle to something meaner, slicking the streets and hammering against the windshield in irregular bursts. Marcus drove. Two others rode behind them in a second vehicle. Nobody spoke. Damien watched the city change outside the window. The storefronts getting older, the streetlights getting fewer, the buildings crowding together like they were bracing against something. He had never been to Elena's apartment. He realized that in the car and felt an odd, specific shame about it. 4 years. He knew her handwriting. He knew she preferred her coffee black with a single sugar, knew she was left-handed, knew she had a habit of pressing her thumbnail against her bottom lip when she was processing a problem. He knew her work schedule better than he knew his own. He did not know where she lived. Her file had given him the address. He hadn't needed to look at her file in 4 years because Elena was always simply there. The building was a 5-story walk-up on Kellner Street, the kind of place that had probably been respectable 30 years ago and had since given up any pretense of ambition. The lobby intercom was broken. One of the overhead lights in the stairwell was out completely. The carpet on the second-floor landing had a water stain the shape of a continent running along one wall. Marcus wanted to go first. Damien moved past him. Apartment 3C was at the end of the hall, and when Damien got close enough, he stopped walking. The door was unlocked, not open, not hanging loose on its hinges, not kicked in, just unlocked. The kind of unlocked that meant someone had left in a hurry or was beyond caring about the door. He drew his firearm, pushed the door inward with 2 fingers. The smell hit him before his eyes adjusted. Iron, antiseptic, cold air from a window that had been left open, stirring a curtain so thin it was nearly transparent. The apartment was dark except for a single lamp on the floor in the far corner. Not a floor lamp, a desk lamp someone had set on the floor, casting everything in low amber and long shadow. He saw the blood on the kitchen tile first, a smear, then a trail, then pooling near the bathroom doorway. Then he saw her. Elena Cross was sitting on the bathroom floor with her back against the wall, and her left leg extended in front of her. She was wearing dark tactical pants and a gray t-shirt that had been cut at the side, and she was holding a curved suture needle between her right thumb and forefinger with the focused, distant expression of someone performing a task that requires every piece of concentration they have left. A knife wound ran along the outer edge of her left thigh, ugly, deep, the edges inflamed in a way that said it had been there too long without proper care. She didn't flinch when he appeared in the doorway, didn't gasp, didn't drop the needle. She simply looked up at him with those dark, exhausted eyes and said quietly, "You shouldn't have come here." "Put the needle down," Damien said. His voice sounded wrong to his own ears. "Too tight. I'm not finished." "Elena, I have 3 more passes." She looked back down at her leg. Her hands were shaking, not badly. Small tremors, the kind that came from pain held too long at arm's length. But they were shaking. "Give me 2 minutes." He crossed the bathroom in 4 steps and crouched beside her. Up close, the wound was worse. The surrounding tissue was red and hot, the kind of angry that meant infection already working its way through. The floor around her held a field hospital improvised from what looked like dollar store medical supplies. Peroxide, gauge pads she'd torn open with her teeth, judging by the packaging, a travel sewing kit she'd repurposed with thread that was not sterile. "How long have you had this?" he asked. "Since Saturday night." 3 days. She'd had an infected knife wound for 3 days and had been managing it alone on a bathroom floor. Who did this? She tied off the last suture, her hands steadier than they had any right to be, and finally set the needle down on the edge of the sink. She took a slow breath through her nose. Then she looked at him and said, "Mateo Ruiz's courier, the one who's been running between your uncle and the Cabranos for the past 6 weeks. Damien went very still. "Say that again." "Your uncle, Damien." Her voice was flat. Not accusing, just facts, delivered the way she always delivered facts. Stripped of decoration, without apology. "Enzo has been meeting with representatives from the Cabrono family since early September. I found the first wire transfer 3 months ago. A shell account in Bratislava moving funds through a Cyprus intermediary to a holding company that traces back to Vincent Carano's second son." The name landed like something thrown hard at glass. Vincent Carano, his future father-in-law. The man Damien was scheduled to stand beside at an altar in 48 hours and call family. "That's not—" He stopped himself before he finished the sentence, because he could hear how it would sound. That's not possible. And he was a man who had built his entire empire on never saying something wasn't possible until he had proof it wasn't. What kind of transfers? Initial payments, 4 of them, ranging from 60 to 90,000. Not operational funds, the kind of transfers you make when you're buying a service. She pressed a fresh gauze pad against her suture with 2 fingers and held it there. Her face was pale, but her eyes were sharp. Then in October, the transfers stopped, and the communication went physical. Courier runs, 3 that I tracked. The third one was Saturday night, Kellner Freight Yard, 10:15. I followed him. She paused. He made me at the gate. He cut you at the freight yard? It was faster than I expected. He was good, said without ego or self-pity, pure assessment. I got the case from him. It's in the kitchen. Damien stood up, looked at the bathroom doorway, looked back at her. Something was moving through him that wasn't quite rage yet. It was the thing that comes before rage, the cold processing stage, when the brain is still adding numbers before the body decides what to do with the sum. You have been investigating my uncle for 3 months, he said carefully, and you didn't tell me. I needed proof you couldn't argue with. You would have argued. She met his eyes without wavering. You love your uncle. He didn't answer that, because she was right, and because the fact that she was right was somehow the most devastating part of everything she'd just said. He walked into the kitchen. The space was jarring in its sparseness. A table, 2 chairs, a counter with almost nothing on it. No coffee maker. A half-empty box of crackers. The refrigerator hummed, and when he passed it, he caught a glimpse through the gap at the bottom of the door. Nearly empty. He didn't let himself stop on that. Not yet. The hard case was on the table. Matte black, locked with a 4-digit code. He looked back at her. She had dragged herself to the bathroom doorway and was leaning in the frame, one hand on the wood. 4712, she said. He opened it. Inside, sealed in separate clear evidence bags and organized with a methodical neatness that was completely Elena regardless of the circumstances, was the proof. Printed wire transfer confirmations with routing numbers annotated in her handwriting. A USB drive. 3 photographs printed on standard paper, Senchaz. 2 men he didn't recognize, flanking a third man whose face he recognized immediately and felt something cold and final move through his chest when he saw his uncle. Enzo Vescari, 71 years old, white-haired, who called Damien Figlio and brought wine to every Christmas dinner and had been at Damien's side since Damien's father died when Damien was 19 and the empire had nearly imploded from the inside. In the photograph, Enzo was shaking hands with someone Damien had only seen in surveillance photos, but knew well enough. Ciro Carano, Vincent's eldest, the one who actually ran operations while his father maintained the political face of the family. The wedding, Damien said, is not a merger, Elena's voice from the doorway. The poison is being administered during the rehearsal dinner. Something slow-acting, neurological. I have the compound listed in the secondary file on the drive. By the time you collapsed, it would have looked like a cardiac event. They were going to have a coroner on payroll for the sign-off. The room was very quiet except for the rain against the open window. And after I was gone, Enzo assumes control under the emergency succession clause in the organizational charter. He sells the port contracts to the Cabranos within 60 days. Carano gets the eastern shipping lanes plus your waterfront operations. Enzo gets enough money to disappear. She paused. He has a property in Montenegro. He bought it in July under his second wife's maiden name. Damien set the photograph down, very deliberately, face down. He had 11 people on his security team, 4 attorneys, 2 accountants with top-secret level clearance for his private accounts, and a network of informants that had cost him more money over the years than most people earned in 3 lifetimes. Not one of them had found this. Elena Cross, who earned a salary that he was now recognizing with nauseating clarity was embarrassingly beneath her actual function, had found all of it, alone. Working from a near-empty apartment on Kellner Street in East Side, managing it in the margins of the regular job she was still doing without complaint, while nursing a knife wound that should have sent her to an emergency room and hadn't, because he turned back to look at her. Why didn't you go to a hospital? Something shifted in her expression, gone almost before it arrived. Hospitals ask questions about knife wounds. Police questions create records. Records create exposure. She said it the way she said everything, logically, cleanly, but she hadn't looked away from the doorframe while she said it, and that slight avoidance told him what the logic wasn't saying. She also hadn't had money for an emergency room. He thought about the empty refrigerator, the dollar store medical supplies, the apartment that cost what it cost because it was the only thing someone making her salary could afford 2 miles deep into the one neighborhood where he had never bothered to look. "How long has your mother been sick?" he asked. Her eyes came back to his, sharp and careful, caught. "That's not relevant to—" "Elena." A long pause, the rain against the window. 18 months, she said quietly. "Progressive neurological. She's in a care facility in Seaverport. It's—" She stopped, regrouped. "The care is good. I handle it." On her salary. She handled an 18-month medical crisis for her mother on her salary while working his accounts, while tracking a conspiracy against his life, while bleeding from a wound on her bathroom floor. Damien looked at the woman in the doorway, pale, injured, her hair loose and tangled, wearing cut-up clothes in an apartment that had nothing in the refrigerator, and felt something that he was not equipped to name and was not going to try to name. Not here, not now. What he was equipped to do was move. "Can you walk?" he asked. "Not well. That's not a no." He crossed the kitchen and came to her and didn't give her time to object. He got his arm behind her and took her weight with a clean, deliberate efficiency. She went rigid immediately, the automatic stiffness of someone who didn't accept physical help easily, didn't accept any kind of help easily, had probably not accepted help since she learned she couldn't afford to. "The drives," she said. "We can't leave the drives." "Marcus." Damien's voice carried back through the apartment to where his head of security was standing near the door, pretending very hard not to have heard everything. "Drives, the case, everything on that table. Nothing gets left." "Already on it," Marcus said quietly. Damien moved her toward the door. She didn't lean into him, but she didn't fight it, and he could feel through the arm wrapped around her how much effort the simple act of moving was costing. 3 days on a bathroom floor. 3 days, and she had still organized the evidence into labeled bags, had still known the 4-digit combination, had still looked at him through the pain with clear, direct eyes and said, "You shouldn't have come here," like he was the one who needed protecting. On the stairs, halfway down to the lobby, she spoke without looking at him. "The rehearsal dinner is in 36 hours, she said. "If your uncle realizes the courier failed to deliver, if either side starts moving—" "I know. Damien, you have a 36-hour window to dismantle an arrangement that's been building for 6 months without triggering either family into open retaliation, while simultaneously canceling a wedding that 200 criminal stakeholders are expecting to attend." Her voice was precise even now. "The timing is the most dangerous part." He looked ahead at the lobby door, the dark and rain beyond it, Marcus already pushing through with the case under his arm. "I know," Damien said again. "Do you have a plan?" He thought about his uncle, Enzo, who had taught him to drive, who had stood over his father's coffin with one hand on Damien's shoulder and said, "The empire doesn't stop, Filio, even today." Enzo, who had been there at every expansion, every negotiation, every hard decision that welded the Viscari name to the waterfront like iron to stone. Enzo, who had been meeting with Ciro Carano since September and buying property in Montenegro, and who had, very quietly and very patiently, been arranging to put his nephew in the ground. "I'm working on one," Damien said. He pushed through the lobby door into the cold rain, carrying Elena Cross out of the apartment she should never have been living in, toward a war that was already 36 hours old. Behind them, the lamp on the floor of 3C was still burning, casting its low amber light across the blood on the tile, the open window, and the empty space where everything had just changed. He thought the wedding was going to be the beginning of something. He had no idea it was already the end, and that the woman he'd carried out of that apartment was the only reason there was anything left to save. The drive back across the Veretti line took 19 minutes. It felt longer. Elena sat in the back seat with her injured leg extended across the leather, the hard case on her lap, her hands folded over it like she was protecting something she didn't fully trust anyone else to hold. Damien sat beside her, not close, but close enough that every time Marcus hit a rough patch of road and the SUV lurched, he felt her tense through the air between them rather than from any sound she made. She didn't make sounds. That was the thing he kept noticing. Any other person with a 3-day infected knife wound being jostled through rain-slicked streets would have hissed, cursed, shifted, and complained. Elena simply breathed, carefully, consciously. The way a person breathes when breathing itself is a decision they're making every few seconds. He watched her from the corner of his eye and said nothing. Marcus was on the phone in the front seat, voice low, coordinating without being told to. That was what 9 years bought. The ability to read a situation from the back of a man's shoulders and begin moving the right pieces without waiting for instruction. Damien heard fragments: estate, medical, discreet, good enough. Good. He looked out the window at the city moving past. The rain had settled into something steadier now. Not violent, just persistent. The kind that soaked through everything eventually and left nothing dry. The streetlights doubled themselves on the wet asphalt. An intersection they passed had a wedding supply store on the corner, white ribbons still strung across the window display from some promotion, and Damien looked at it for exactly 2 seconds before he turned his face back to the road ahead. 34 hours. That was what they had left. He ran the arithmetic in his head, the way he always ran arithmetic. Cold, sequential, without sentiment attached to any variable. 200 guests confirmed for the wedding. 43 of those guests were operational stakeholders, capos, lieutenants, intermediary contacts whose presence at the ceremony was itself a political statement. 17 of them had traveled from outside the city. Canceling the wedding without explanation would send those 17 people back to their respective operations with questions Damien couldn't afford to have circulating. Canceling it with explanation meant admitting to a conspiracy that, until he had dealt with Enzo personally, he couldn't fully control the narrative around. And then there was Sophia. He hadn't called her yet. He was going to have to call her. That conversation was going to require a precision he wasn't sure he had access to right now. With Elena bleeding quietly beside him and his uncle's face still sitting face down in his mind, like the photograph he'd turned over in that kitchen. The estate gates opened before Marcus reached them. Someone had called ahead. The main house came into view through the rain. 3 stories, sandstone and glass, the kind of architecture that communicated exactly what it was designed to communicate about the man who lived inside it. 2 of his security team were already on the front steps. One of them was moving toward the SUV before it stopped rolling. Damien had the door open before Marcus cut the engine. "I can walk," Elena said. "You've been walking on it for 3 days." "And I'm still walking on it." Her voice was even, not stubborn, practical, like she was making a resource calculation. "If your security team sees you carry me inside, it changes how they read this situation." He stopped with his hand on the doorframe, looked at her. She was right about that. She was right about that in a way that told him she'd thought about the optics of her own injury before he had, while sitting in his back seat with an infected wound. And that was either impressive or it was the saddest thing he'd encountered all week, and he couldn't decide which. He stepped back and let her maneuver herself out. She did it without asking for assistance, one hand on the seat back, the other on the doorframe. A brief controlled pause at the moment of weight transfer when her left leg took the ground. Her jaw tightened. That was all. She stood upright, adjusted the hard case under her arm, and walked toward the front steps at a pace that was measured and deliberate and cost her something with every step. Damien walked beside her, not supporting her, just beside her. Inside, he handed her off to Mrs. Reyes, his estate manager, 60 years old, unflappable in the way that people become unflappable after they've seen enough, with instructions that were specific and non-negotiable. The East Wing guest room, fresh linens, medical kit from the secure cabinet, and Dr. Farrow called immediately, regardless of the hour. He didn't ask if Elena was comfortable with this. He looked at Elena once, and she gave the smallest possible nod, which he took as permission and also suspected was partly capitulation from someone who had run entirely out of the energy required to refuse. Then he went to his office and closed the door. Marcus was already inside. He'd beaten Damien up somehow, taken the stairs faster, and was standing at the window with his arms crossed and his face doing the thing it did when he was organizing a great deal of information and a great deal of concern into a shape he could present without either one bleeding into the other. "Talk," Damien said. "The drive." Marcus turned from the window. "My man Teague ran the first layer on the USB in the car. The wire transfers check out. Routing numbers are real. Accounts exist. The Bratislava Shell Company has been active since August. moving money in patterns consistent with pre-operational payments. He paused. She documented everything in sequence: transaction dates, correspondent bank IDs, annotations on the holding company structure. It's thorough. It's meticulous, Damien said. That's different. Yeah? Marcus looked at him with something careful in his eyes. It is. Damien sat down in the chair behind his desk, didn't lean back, sat forward with his elbows on the desk surface and his hands loose in front of him, the way he sat when he needed his body to stay still while his brain moved fast. What's your read on the timeline? If the courier didn't deliver whatever was in that case, whoever sent him is going to notice soon, if they haven't already. Marcus uncrossed his arms. Saturday night was 4 days ago. A courier doesn't go dark for 4 days without someone pulling the thread. Which means Ciro Carano already knows something went wrong. Maybe. Or Enzo does. Or both. Marcus let that sit in the air between them for a second. Question is whether they know she was involved. If they do, they don't know she exists, Damien said. No, nobody knows she exists. That's been the problem. The irony of that landed somewhere uncomfortable, and he didn't address it. He picked up his phone, put it down, picked it up again. He called Sophia at 11:47 p.m. She answered on the second ring, which meant she'd been awake, which meant something had already reached her. He could hear it in the one-beat pause before she said his name, the texture of a woman recalibrating. Damien. Warm surface over something that wasn't warm. It's late. I know. He kept his voice level, neutral, the voice he used in negotiations when he needed the other person to believe they were having a different conversation than the one actually happening. I need to move the rehearsal dinner. Scheduling conflict with the venue. I'll have my people contact yours in the morning to rearrange. A silence. Shorter than it should have been if she were genuinely surprised. The day before our wedding, she said. Logistics, he said. It happens. Of course. Another pause. Is everything all right? You sound tired, he said. It's been a long evening. I'll call you tomorrow. He ended the call and set the phone face down on the desk. Marcus looked at him. She knew something was off, Damien said. She recovered fast, but she knew. Could just be, no. He stood up. Get me everything you have on Ciro Carano's current location, and I want eyes on Enzo. Physical surveillance, 2 men minimum, starting now. He doesn't move without me knowing. And the wedding guests? Damien thought for a moment. Hold all communications until morning. I need a few hours before this becomes a fire I can't control the direction of. He moved toward the door. And Marcus, the woman in the East Wing. I'll personally make sure she doesn't leave and nobody gets near her without my sign-off. He said it flatly, not possessive, protective. The distinction mattered to him, and he was aware that it mattered to him, which was itself new information. Whatever she needs. He went to bed for approximately 90 minutes and did not sleep for a single one of them. At 4:15 in the morning, his phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize. He answered it anyway because men in his position answered unknown numbers at 4:15 in the morning because the unknown numbers at 4:15 were always the ones that mattered. Vescari. The voice was male. Careful. The kind of careful that meant the speaker knew exactly how dangerous this call was. You don't know me. I work logistics for the Carano family. Internal only. Damien sat up in the dark. Keep talking. I'm not doing this for free. I want relocation and I want it funded. I don't negotiate with strangers at 4 in the morning. Then you can find out what I know from whoever kills you at your rehearsal dinner instead. A beat. The compound. They've changed delivery vectors. It's not in the drink anymore. They moved it to the bread service. Specific rolls prepared off-site, wrapped and labeled. Whoever sits nearest the head of table, closest to you, will handle the swap personally. Damien's hand tightened on the phone. Who is the swap? A pause that lasted 3 seconds and felt like 30. Your uncle, the voice said. He requested the role himself. The line went dead. Damien sat in the dark for a long moment. Then he got up, pulled on clothes, and walked down the hall to the East Wing. He knocked. There was a pause. Brief, the kind that meant she'd been awake. And then Elena said, "Come in." in a voice that was collected in a way it had no business being at 4:20 in the morning after 3 days on a bathroom floor. The room was lit by the small lamp on the nightstand. She was sitting up in the bed with a laptop open and the hard case beside her, the USB drive already slotted in. She'd changed into what looked like borrowed clothes, one of the spare sets his estate manager kept for unexpected guests, and someone had redressed the wound properly because the bandaging on her leg was clean and tight and correctly applied. Her hair was back in the severe dark ponytail she wore to work, like she'd put on her professional self the moment she'd had access to a shower. He stood in the doorway and looked at the laptop screen. "You couldn't sleep either," he said. "I found the secondary account structure." She turned the laptop slightly so he could see the screen from the doorway. "There's a third party, not Carano, not Enzo, a separate financial intermediary that's been skimming off both sides of the arrangement, someone who positioned themselves between the two families and has been collecting a fee for facilitating the communication without either side knowing." She looked up at him. "Someone on your side of the ledger, Damien. Someone with access to your internal routing numbers." He walked into the room and sat in the chair across from the bed, told her about the phone call. She listened without interrupting. That was one of the things about her. She listened the way a surgeon listened to a patient describe symptoms, with her entire attention calibrated and nothing wasted. When he finished, she was quiet for 4 seconds. Exactly 4 seconds. And he'd noticed she did that. Took a precise, brief moment before responding to anything significant, like she was running the information through something internal that needed a beat to process cleanly. "The call was a plant," she said, "or a genuine defector. Consider the timing. You've moved nothing yet. You've made one phone call to Sophia that was designed to reveal nothing. If the Carano side had any intelligence that you were aware of the conspiracy, they'd have moved already. Accelerated the timeline, not sent you inside information through an anonymous number." She shifted slightly, a small, controlled movement that suggested the leg was talking to her even through the new bandaging. "Someone on your end of this wants you looking at your uncle as the primary threat, not at the third party, not at whoever has access to your routing numbers." The room went quiet except for the rain, which was still coming down outside, softer now, like the sky had exhausted itself. "So either the uncle is a distraction," Damien said slowly, "or the uncle is real, and there's a fourth player managing which pieces you see and when." She closed the laptop partway. "Either way, you cannot touch Enzo tonight, not until we know who built this architecture and why they want you looking at him first." Damien looked at her, at the laptop, at the USB drive she'd extracted from a courier at a freight yard in the dark, while someone was putting a knife in her leg, at the secondary account structures she'd been mapping at 4 in the morning from a bed she was supposed to be recovering in. "Why did you do this?" he asked. She looked back at him with those dark, direct eyes. "Do what?" 3 months. Alone. You could have come to me with the first wire transfer and let me handle it. With what proof? A single anomalous transaction you could have explained away? She shook her head, a small, precise movement. You would have confronted Enzo. Enzo would have denied it. The evidence would have been compromised because Enzo would have known you were looking. She paused. And you would have believed him. Because you wanted to. He didn't answer that. Because it was true, and they both knew it was true. "That's not why I'm asking," he said. A long moment. The rain against the window. Elena looking at him with an expression that was doing several careful things simultaneously. Considering, measuring, deciding something. "You gave my mother's care facility a tax-deductible donation 2 years ago," she said finally. "You didn't know I knew. It came through a foundation account I happened to process. $40,000, anonymously flagged to her floor's nursing fund." A beat. "You never mentioned it." He hadn't remembered that. He processed so many financial decisions that individual line items blurred within weeks. But he believed her, because Elena did not invent financial details. "That doesn't explain—" "It explains part of it." Her voice was quiet now. Not soft, exactly. Just quieter. "The rest is simpler. You built something. It's imperfect, and it's brutal, and most of the people protecting it are protecting it for the wrong reasons. But it functions. It employs people. It keeps certain agreements in place that keep worse things from filling the space." She looked down at the laptop. "I'm good at my job. I don't like waste. He almost said something. He stopped himself because whatever he said would have been either inadequate or more than he knew how to follow up on in a room at 4:30 in the morning. And Damien Viscari had not survived 20 years in this business by making statements he wasn't prepared to defend completely. What he said instead was, "Get some sleep. 3 hours minimum. The routing numbers will still be wrong in 3 hours. Sleep." She looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone choosing between two responses they've already prepared. Then she closed the laptop, set it on the nightstand, and said, "There's a name in the third subsidiary account, partially redacted in the print documents but recoverable from the digital layer on the drive. I haven't run it yet. Run it in 3 hours. Damien." She said his name without inflection, the way she said it at work, precise, functional, cutting through whatever else was in the air. If that name is who I think it might be, based on the account structure and the access patterns, then we don't have 3 hours. We have one conversation to have before this entire situation becomes something neither of us can manage. He looked at her steadily. "Who do you think it is?" She opened the laptop again, pulled up the drive, navigated 3 folders deep with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been inside this file structure long enough to know it by memory. Then she turned the screen toward him. The name was partially obscured by a block redaction in the scanned document, but below it, in the digital metadata she'd annotated in a separate window, was a recovery string. 14 characters. A name he recognized immediately and wished with everything in him that he didn't. Not Enzo, not Ciro Carano, not anyone he'd built a war plan around in the last 4 hours. His head of security? Marcus. The room felt like it tilted slightly, like the walls moved 2 inches in a direction rooms didn't move. Damien's chest did something that wasn't quite any emotion he had a word for. More like a structural thing, something load-bearing giving way very quietly beneath everything stacked on top of it. 9 years. Marcus had been with him for 9 years. He stood up slowly, did not look away from the screen. "How certain," he said. His voice came out very flat. The account access timestamps matched the nights Marcus had solo overnight authorization in the financial vault. There are 6 instances across 3 months, all corresponding to transfer windows in the conspiracy timeline. Elena's voice was steady in the way that it had been steady on the bathroom floor. The steadiness of someone holding something difficult extremely still because the alternative was worse. "I'm not certain, but I'm close enough to certain that you cannot let him continue coordinating your security response." Damien thought about the drive from Kellner Street. Marcus in the front seat, on the phone, estate, medical, discreet. He thought about how Marcus had been inside his office before him when they returned. He thought about the anonymous call at 4:15, the voice careful and deliberate, and how a man who had worked security for 9 years would know exactly how to modulate a voice to be unrecognizable, and would know exactly what specific detail, the bread service, the uncle's role, would send Damien's attention in precisely the wrong direction. He thought about Elena in the East Wing, alone, with Marcus having full access to the estate's layout, security rotation, and door codes. He was already moving toward the door before the thought finished forming, pulling his phone, scrolling to a number that bypassed Marcus entirely. His secondary security captain, a man named Reeves who reported directly to Damien and had never been looped into Marcus's chain of command, an operational redundancy Damien had built in years ago and never expected to use. "I need Marcus Hale detained," he said when Reeves answered. Quietly. No confrontation, no communication from him before it's done. "Do you understand me?" "Yes, sir." Reeves, to his credit, didn't hesitate. "Location? Find him." Damien's voice was iron. "He's somewhere in this building and he knows every room in it, so move fast." He hung up and stood in the doorway of Elena's room, one hand on the frame, looking back at her. She was watching him with those steady dark eyes, already knowing what he'd decided from the speed at which he'd moved. Already, he realized, having anticipated this moment from the second she'd shown him the screen, having calculated how he'd react, how fast, what he'd need to do next, because that was what she did, what she had always done, running 3 steps ahead of a situation in the silence behind her desk, while everyone around her assumed she was simply taking notes. "There's something else," she said. He waited. "The weapons." She pulled up a second file. "The final stage of the operation isn't the wedding. The wedding was the distraction. Something to focus your attention on a single event at a single location while the actual move happened somewhere else. She turned the screen again. Enzo has already transferred access codes and security schematics for your waterfront warehouse to the Carano family. Military-grade inventory. The cash you've been holding as leverage for the past 18 months. If they move on that warehouse before you do, they won't just have your ports. They'll have enough hardware to make any counterattack by your organization impossible. He stared at the screen. When? He said. Based on the operational pattern and the timeline built around the wedding as cover, she looked directly at him. 14 hours. Maybe less. 14 hours. No Marcus, a potential fourth player still unidentified. A wedding cancellation that hadn't been made yet, 200 guests and every criminal stakeholder in the city watching for any signal of instability from the Vescari organization. And in the middle of all of it, Damien Vescari standing in a borrowed room at 4:30 in the morning, looking at the woman who had quietly been the most important person in his organization for 4 years while he'd been looking everywhere else. "Can you work on the routing analysis for another hour?" he said. "Then sleep. I need you functional." "I'm already functional. More functional." She looked at him for a moment, then she nodded once, turned back to the laptop. He walked out of the room and pulled the door most of the way closed behind him, leaving a gap of 4 inches, and took 3 steps down the hallway before he stopped. Stood still in the dark corridor with the rain coming down outside the windows and the weight of every decision that needed to be made inside the next 12 hours pressing down on him from all directions at once. He'd built his empire on knowing who to trust. He'd been certain about Marcus for 9 years. He'd been planning a wedding for 6 months and hadn't known it was his funeral. He'd had the most valuable person in his organization earning a salary that couldn't cover a medical crisis, living in an apartment with nothing in the refrigerator, bleeding alone on a bathroom floor, and he had never once driven to Kellner Street to check. Down the hall, he heard the soft sound of Reeves and his men moving through the east corridor toward the staff quarters where Marcus slept. He didn't feel satisfaction about it. He didn't feel vindicated or decisive. He felt the specific, heavy weight of a man who had been wrong about everything he thought he was certain of, and who now had 14 hours to be right about everything that Reeves found Marcus in the kitchen. Not in his room, not in the security monitoring station where a man on overnight watch should have been. In the kitchen, standing at the counter with a glass of water in his hand and his jacket still on, which meant he hadn't been to bed at all, which meant he had been waiting for something. The detail registered with Damien in the 2 seconds between Reeves's quiet radio click and the moment Damien pushed through the kitchen door himself. Marcus turned when the door opened. He looked at Reeves first, then at the 2 men flanking Reeves, then at Damien, and the sequence of those glances told Damien everything. Because Marcus looked at the armed men before he looked at his boss, and a man with a clean conscience did that in the reverse order. "Damien." Marcus set the glass down slowly, controlled. "What's happening?" Not a question, a statement wearing a question's clothes. "Sit down," Damien said. "I'm fine standing." "Marcus?" Damien's voice was flat and absolute in the way it got when the discussion was already over and the person being spoken to hadn't realized it yet. "Sit down." A pause that lasted 2 beats too long. Then Marcus pulled out a chair and sat. Damien remained standing. He set his phone on the counter face up, the screen showing the account metadata Elena had pulled, the recovery string, the timestamps, the 6 instances of overnight access matched to Marcus's solo authorization windows. He turned the phone so Marcus could see it from the chair. Marcus looked at the screen. His face did something extremely small and extremely controlled. A micro-movement at the jaw, a slight adjustment around the eyes, and then it went back to the neutral professional expression he'd worn for 9 years. That micro-movement was the tell. An innocent man's face would have done something larger. Confusion, the forward lean of someone trying to read an explanation, the open mouth of a question forming. Marcus's face did the smallest possible thing and then shut down. The face of a man managing information, not receiving it. "Talk," Damien said. "I don't know what I'm looking at." "Yes, you do." "Damien, those timestamps could be—" "Don't." The word came out quiet and final. "Don't tell me what those timestamps could be. I've had 9 years of watching you think. I know what it looks like when you're building a story versus when you're telling me something true. You're building right now. He pulled the chair across from Marcus and sat in it, close, elbows on the table. So let's skip the part where I get angry and you get creative and we waste 40 minutes we don't have. Tell me your version of what this is. Marcus looked at him. 9 years of working beside someone did something to the eyes between two people. It created a kind of language that operated below words, a fluency in the other person's silences and weight shifts and the exact quality of their stillness. Damien watched Marcus read him the same way Damien was reading Marcus, and watched Marcus arrive at the same calculation he'd arrived at. There was no version of this conversation with an exit. I didn't sell you out, Marcus said. That's a specific denial for something you claim not to recognize. I facilitated communication, a muscle in his jaw. There's a difference. Damien felt something move through him that was not quite rage. The thing below rage, the geological thing, the kind of anger that didn't get loud because it was too large to make noise. Communication between my uncle and the family that was planning to kill me. I didn't know about the killing. Marcus's voice shifted slightly, the careful quality cracking at the edges, something genuine leaking through. That is the truth. I knew Enzo was making contact with the Cabranos. I was told it was a secondary alliance, a contingency arrangement in case the Carano wedding collapsed. Insurance. Nothing operational. And you believed that. I was paid to believe it. He said it without flinching. That was the thing about Marcus. He'd never been a man who dressed things up. Brutal honesty deployed in service of brutal decisions. It was why Damien had trusted him. It was why this particular betrayal had an elegance to it that made it worse. 60,000 over 4 months. Routed through the subsidiary the same way Elena found it, because I used the same architecture Enzo used when he set it up. I didn't know she was tracking. Nobody knew she was tracking, Damien said. That was the point. Marcus stopped himself. Finish it. She's better than anyone you're paying her to be, said quietly, almost with something like respect, which made it land worse. I underestimated what she'd find. Damien stood up. He didn't do anything with his hands. He stood up and took one step back from the table and breathed through his nose for a controlled 3 seconds, because the alternative was something he couldn't afford right now, with 14 hours on the clock and an empire hemorrhaging from 4 different wounds simultaneously. The anonymous call at 4:15, he said. Marcus said nothing. You sent it, the bread service detail, pointing me at Enzo. He looked at the older man, making sure I went at my uncle before I went at the account structure, before Elena could pull the name. Still nothing. Was Enzo even real? Damien asked. Or was the uncle the architecture from the beginning? The thing you built to make sure if anyone found a thread, they pulled him instead of you? Marcus looked up from the table. And for the first time in 9 years, Damien saw something in that face that wasn't calculation or control or professional neutrality. It was something closer to grief. The specific grief of a man who made a decision that couldn't be unmade and had known it couldn't be unmade at the moment he made it. Your uncle is real, Marcus said. The Bratislava accounts are his. The conspiracy against the wedding is his and Ciro Carano's. All of it. The poison, the succession clause, Montenegro. Elena got every bit of that right. A pause. I was a conduit, not an architect. They needed someone with internal access to past logistics without triggering your network monitoring. I provided that. I thought I was selling operational access, not your life. At what point, Damien said very carefully, did you realize what you'd actually sold? The pause lasted 5 seconds. 2 weeks ago, Marcus said. 2 weeks. He had known for 2 weeks that the wedding was an assassination and had said nothing. Had driven Damien to venue meetings and security briefings and suit fittings, and had known and said nothing. Damien looked at the man he'd trusted with his physical safety for nearly a decade and felt the specific cold clarity of understanding that some debts couldn't be settled with logic. Put him in the east basement, he told Reeves. No phone, no communication. Someone sits outside the door until I say otherwise. Marcus stood when Reeves moved toward him. He didn't resist. He looked at Damien once more. That same expression, that complicated grief. And then he walked toward the door with Reeves's hand on his arm and the sound of his footsteps on the kitchen tile going away down the corridor. Damien stood alone in the kitchen. The glass of water Marcus had set on the counter was still there. Still had his fingerprints on it. Still had a small ring of condensation spreading underneath it on the marble surface, growing slowly outward the way water always did when you stopped paying attention. He picked up his phone and went back upstairs. Elena was not asleep. He hadn't expected her to be. She'd pushed the lamp to the edge of the nightstand to extend its reach and had the laptop and 3 legal pads arranged around her on the bed, one open to a page of handwritten account notations in her small, extremely precise script. She looked up when he came back through the door and read his face in 1 second. He confirmed it, she said. Facilitation, not architecture. He claims he didn't know about the assassination until 2 weeks ago. Do you believe him? Damien considered that honestly. On the specific claim, yes. On the broader question of whether it matters, no. She nodded once, accepted that without editorializing. Then she turned one of the legal pads toward him. I found the weapons transfer documentation. The warehouse access codes were sent to the Carano side 6 days ago through Marcus's channel, which means Ciro Carano has had active access to your waterfront inventory for almost a week. She pressed 2 fingers against her bottom lip. That habit, the thumbnail against the lip when she was processing, except now it was 2 fingers pressed flat, the gesture of someone who'd been pushing past a threshold for so long the usual tells had shifted. They haven't moved on it yet, which is strange. Why wait? Because moving on the warehouse prematurely exposes the conspiracy before the wedding creates the political cover they need. She looked up. They need you dead first. The warehouse seizure was designed to happen after the rehearsal dinner, while your organization was still in shock and before anyone could consolidate around a successor. Without the wedding as cover, without you being incapacitated, she paused. They're in a holding pattern, waiting to see if the plan still executes. Or waiting to see if I've discovered it, Damien said. Yes. Her eyes were very direct. Which brings me to the thing I need to tell you that I've been sitting with for the last 20 minutes. He waited. She set the legal pad down. The gesture had a finality to it, setting down the work, picking up the harder thing. I cross-referenced the compound in the secondary file. The poison they planned to use, the neurological agent. She met his eyes steadily. It requires cold-chain pharmaceutical storage and a very specific preparation window. It cannot be transported long distances without degradation. It has to be prepared locally, within hours of administration. A beat. Which means there's a preparation facility somewhere in the city, and whoever is running that facility is not Enzo. He doesn't have the technical background. And it's not Ciro Carano directly because he hasn't been in the city since October according to the movement records I pulled. Damien felt something cold settle at the base of his spine. Who has pharmaceutical infrastructure in this city? He said slowly. Not a question, working it out while he said it. Elena picked up a photograph from the legal pad beneath the first one. A surveillance image, grainy, printed from the drive. 2 men outside what looked like a cold storage facility in the industrial district. She set it on the edge of the bed where he could see it. He recognized one of them. Of course he recognized one of them. The universe he was learning tonight had a very specific sense of humor. Dr. Arnaud Ferris, 62 years old. Retired pharmaceutical executive, known in certain circles as a man who had no political affiliations, no criminal connections, no involvement in anything beyond his charity work in his very expensive apartment on the north side of the city. Also known to exactly 3 people, Damien, Marcus, and 1 attorney now in federal custody on unrelated charges, as the man Damien had used twice in the last decade to manage the quiet medical situations that organizations like his occasionally required to disappear. A man who had Damien's financial prints on 2 transactions that, if they ever surfaced in the wrong context, would constitute evidence of something Damien could not talk his way out of in any courtroom in any jurisdiction. Which meant Ferris wasn't just preparing the poison. Ferris was insurance. If Damien moved against the Caranos without eliminating Ferris first, Ferris released the documentation on those 2 prior transactions, and Damien's legal exposure became unsurvivable. If Damien moved against Ferris first, he tipped off the Carano side that the plan was compromised, and they'd accelerate the warehouse operation before he had men in position to stop it. He was looking at a trap, within a trap, within a trap. And he had 12 hours. No head of security, an uncle he still hadn't touched, and a woman with a knife wound sitting on a bed full of legal pads who had done more to save his empire in 3 months than everyone he paid to protect it had done in a decade. How long have you known about Ferris? He said. I found his name in the facility records 40 minutes ago. She held his gaze. I didn't know about your prior relationship with him. I worked that out from the expression on your face just now. He sat down in the chair, put his head back and looked at the ceiling for a moment, not from defeat, but from the specific need that extreme pressure sometimes created to have 3 seconds of not looking at anything that required a response. Then he sat forward. The cold storage facility, he said. What's the address? She told him. He wrote it on the legal pad without looking down. If we move on the facility before the warehouse, he said, thinking aloud, we take Ferris off the board, but we lose our window at the waterfront. If we move on the warehouse first, Ferris releases the documentation, unless we move simultaneously. He looked at her. Which requires splitting our operational capacity in half with no security chief and a 12-hour window. Elena was quiet for a moment. Then she said, there's a third option. Tell me. We don't move on either of them yet. She pulled the first legal pad back toward her and turned to a fresh page. We let the wedding appear to proceed. We give Enzo and Carano no reason to believe the plan has been compromised for the next 6 hours. During those 6 hours, we build a position that allows us to move on both targets simultaneously, the facility and the warehouse. At the same moment, the rehearsal dinner was scheduled to begin. She paused. We use their timeline against them. They planned everything around that window. The facility will be staffed. The warehouse crew will be staged. Everyone will be in position for a plan that we've already neutralized at the center. Damien looked at her for a long moment. That requires Enzo believing the wedding is still happening long enough for him to stay in place and not trigger a secondary protocol. Yes. Which means I have to call him. Yes. And talk to my uncle like I don't know. She met his eyes. Yes. He exhaled through his nose, stood up, walked to the window and looked out at the estate grounds in the pre-dawn dark, the rain still coming down, the security lights casting pale circles on the wet grass. Somewhere in the east basement, Marcus was sitting in a chair thinking through the consequences of a decision made 4 months ago. Somewhere across the city, Enzo Viscari was probably sleeping the sleep of a man who believed his plan was on schedule. Somewhere in an industrial cold storage facility, a man who knew enough about Damien's past to end him was preparing the mechanism of his death. He thought about his father. It came to him suddenly and without invitation. A memory of standing in the same house when he was 19 years old, the night his father's body was brought home, and Enzo putting a hand on his shoulder and saying, "The empire doesn't stop, Figlio." He'd taken that as wisdom. He'd held it for 20 years like a compass. He turned it over now and looked at what was underneath it. A man positioning himself at the shoulder of a grieving 19-year-old. Patient, long-term. Planting himself as the irreplaceable pillar so that when the time came, 15 years later, 20, whenever the asset had been built to its maximum value, the harvest would be worth the wait. How long had Enzo been planning this? That was the question that hit him now, standing at the window, that he hadn't let himself ask before because the answer pointed somewhere he wasn't ready to look. Not 6 months. Not since the Carano alliance was proposed. What if it had started the night his father died, when a 60-year-old man pressed his hand to a teenager's shoulder and began the longest investment of his career? Damien. Elena's voice from the bed, quiet, direct. He turned. She was watching him with an expression he hadn't seen on her face before. Not at work, not in the apartment, not in the car. Something that was neither professional nor analytical. Something that was simply human and present, and that didn't look away from him. "Make the call," she said. "Then come back here and we build the plan together. That's what we do right now. That's all." He nodded once. The movement was small and not particularly composed, which was the most honest thing his body had done all night. He dialed Enzo at 5:08 in the morning. His uncle answered on the third ring with the groggy texture of a man genuinely woken from sleep, or the rehearsed texture of a man who had been waiting for the call and knew how to sound genuine. Damien could no longer tell the difference and understood that he might never have been able to. Figlio. Warm, the voice he'd known his entire life. "What time is it?" "Early. I'm sorry to wake you." Damien's voice was perfectly even. The negotiations voice, the voice that had closed deals across 3 decades and had never once cracked under pressure. "I wanted to hear your voice. Nerves, I think. Pre-wedding." A brief pause. Then Enzo's voice warmed further, something fond entering it that Damien now heard as the performance it had always been. Nerves are natural. Your father had nerves, I remember. A low sound that might have been a laugh. The wedding will be beautiful. Everything is arranged perfectly. You have nothing to worry about. Everything is arranged perfectly. You're right, Damien said. Go back to sleep. I'll see you at the dinner. He hung up, stood for a moment with the phone in his hand. Then he went back into Elena's room, pulled the chair up to the edge of the bed where the legal pads were spread, and said, "Tell me the plan." She picked up the pen. The facility team goes in at 7 tonight, 2 hours before the rehearsal dinner was scheduled. Your men hold Ferris and the documentation simultaneously. We need someone with technical forensics to image his drives before a sound from somewhere below. Not close. Distant. The estate's perimeter system. A low tone that meant a sensor had registered something at the outer wall. Not an alarm. A notification. The difference between the two was significant, and Damien knew his own security system well enough to parse it in half a second. He was already on his feet. He crossed to the window and looked out at the south perimeter. The rain had thinned to almost nothing in the last hour, and the grounds were visible in the gray pre-dawn light. For a moment there was nothing, just wet grass and trees and the pale security lights. Then he saw them. 3 vehicles, black, stopped on the service road that ran along the outside of the south wall, maybe 200 meters from the gate. Not moving. Just sitting there in the early morning gray with their headlights off, positioned at intervals that weren't random and weren't the positioning of cars that had simply stopped on a road. The spacing was tactical. The positioning was a staging formation. They hadn't moved yet, but they were there, and they were not there by accident. He turned back to Elena. She had already pulled herself upright, already reading his face, already reaching for the legal pads to consolidate them into the hard case with the focused efficiency of someone who understood in an instant that the timeline had just collapsed. "They're not waiting for the wedding," she said. "No," Damien said. "They're not." He went to the nightstand drawer, took out the firearm he'd put there when he'd first brought her to this room. A compact 9mm, safety on, full magazine. Set it on the bed beside her hand. She looked at it, then at him. "I don't need—" "It's not a question of what you need." He met her eyes and said the next part plainly, without performance or decoration, because there was no time for either. "If anyone gets through the East Wing, you use it. Don't negotiate. Don't wait for them to identify themselves. Anyone through that door who isn't me or Reeves." Elena looked at the gun, then she picked it up and checked the magazine in one clean, practiced motion that told him she already knew how, had always known how, and had simply never had occasion to demonstrate it. He didn't have time to think about what that said about who she was. He moved to the door. "Damien!" Her voice stopped him at the threshold. He turned. She was sitting on the bed with the hard case in her lap, and the firearm in her right hand and her leg bandaged and her hair back, and an expression that he had never seen directed at him before in 4 years of occupying the same professional space. Something open and unguarded that she hadn't had time to close off before it reached her face, that lived for exactly 1 second before her professional composure reclaimed it. "Come back," she said. 2 words. Flat. Practical. The most precise thing she had said all night. He looked at her for 1 second longer than he had time for. Then he pulled the door closed and ran. Downstairs, Reeves was already coordinating. His radio crackled with overlapping voices from the perimeter teams. Damien took the stairs 3 at a time, already reaching for his own weapon, already calculating positions and angles and the gap between 3 vehicles staged outside a wall and the moment they stopped staging and became something worse. They had come early. Someone had told them to come early. And the only person who had known enough to tell them, who had known the estate layout, the security rotations, the optimal approach vector, was currently sitting in the east basement with no phone. Except Marcus had been in the kitchen for a reason. Standing at the counter with his jacket still on, a glass of water in his hand, waiting for something. Damien hit the bottom of the stairs and pulled up short. Reeves was at the front door. His radio crackled once more. A voice from the south perimeter, taut and brief. "They're moving." And somewhere in the east basement, Marcus had made a phone call before Reeves's men got to him because there had been a window, small, a matter of minutes, between Damien leaving Elena's room and Reeves reaching the kitchen, and Marcus had been in the kitchen with his jacket on because he had already used that Marcus had made the call from the kitchen. That was the only way the math worked. Reeves's men had reached the basement in 4 minutes from the moment Damien gave the order. 4 minutes was enough time to make one call if you already had the number ready. If you'd been standing at that counter with your jacket on and your phone in your pocket waiting for the moment your boss's attention shifted somewhere else long enough for 30 seconds of silence. Damien hit the ground floor at a run and didn't stop moving. Reeves, his voice cut through the radio chatter the way it always cut through noise, not loud, just absolute. How many? South perimeter, 3 vehicles, estimate 8 to 12. Reeves was already at the front door, weapon drawn, 2 men flanking him. East wall sensor triggered 30 seconds after the south. Could be a second team moving to cut off the back egress. They're trying to box the building. Damien checked his weapon one more time, a motion so habitual it registered as breathing. Who's on the east? Tanner and Cole. Pull them back inside. Don't engage at the wall. Let them get through the perimeter and take them in the courtyard. We want them in the light, not in the dark outside it. Reeves relayed the order. Damien was already moving through the main corridor toward the security monitoring room, a room that Marcus had designed and that Damien was now entering with the specific alertness of a man walking through a space he can no longer fully trust. The screens were live. 6 camera feeds showing the grounds from different angles, the resolution good enough in the pre-dawn gray to see the first vehicle moving along the south wall. He watched it for 3 seconds, read the movement, made the calculation. They're not trying to breach quietly, he said to no one in particular. They're moving too fast. They want confusion, not stealth. A crash from the south side of the building, not an explosion, a gate coming down, the specific metal-on-concrete sound of a vehicle pushing through a secured entrance without stopping. Then another. Then the courtyard lights blazed on as Reeves's men triggered the perimeter floods, and for a moment the screens turned white before the cameras compensated. Then the shooting started. It didn't sound the way it sounded in films, the clean, sharp crack of individual shots in dramatic sequence. It sounded like rapid, overlapping percussion, the kind that blurred into continuous noise, punctuated by the occasional hard bang of something larger. Damien moved out of the monitoring room and back into the main corridor. His body knew what to do in this without his conscious mind needing to direct it. He had been in firefights before. Not many, but enough to know that the worst thing a man in his position could do was stand still and think. He went right, through the service corridor that ran along the east wing toward the back of the house. Reeves's voice came through the radio. South courtyard, 3 down. But Damien, there's a 4th vehicle. It wasn't on the service road. It came from the north. North side of the estate was the blind spot. It always had been. Marcus had designed the security protocol, and the north approach was the least monitored because historically it faced toward Allied territory. Damien had known that and had never changed it because Marcus had never given him a reason to question it. He kept moving. Through the service corridor, past the kitchen, past the door to the east basement stairwell, and he stopped. The stairwell door was open. He had not opened it. Reeves's men had locked it behind them when they put Marcus inside. It was open now, swinging slightly on its hinges, and the light at the bottom of the stairs was out. He went in anyway, because there was no version of this where he didn't. The basement was dark, and it smelled like cold concrete and old storage, and the particular metallic edge of a space recently occupied by someone who'd left under duress. The chair where Marcus had been seated was on its side. The zip ties Reeves had used were on the floor, cut clean through. Not broken, not worked loose through patient effort. Cut. Someone had come down here with a blade and freed him, which meant there was a 4th person in this building who Damien had not accounted for, who had been here before the vehicles hit the perimeter, who had planned the extraction before the attack began. He stood in the dark for exactly 2 seconds, listening. Then he turned and went back up the stairs faster than he'd come down them and got on the radio to Reeves with a single instruction. Find the 4th player. Someone is already inside. He was running back toward the east wing before Reeves responded. The corridor to Elena's room was clear when he reached it. The door was still most of the way closed, the 4-inch gap he'd left still intact. Through the gap he could see the edge of the lamp's light. He pushed the door open with one hand and his weapon up with the other, and Elena was on the far side of the room standing against the wall beside the window, the 9mm raised in a 2-handed grip, aimed directly at the center of his chest. She lowered it the instant she registered his face. Her exhale was controlled but audible. "There's someone else in the building," he said. "I know." Her voice was level. "I heard footsteps in the corridor 9 minutes ago. Not yours. Different weight distribution, different pace." She had already moved the hard case to the floor and kicked it under the bed, minimizing what could be grabbed, what could be used as leverage. He had not told her to do that. She had done it the way she did everything, without instruction, 3 steps ahead of the situation. "Marcus is out of the basement," he said. "Then we move." She was already pushing off the wall, reaching for her jacket with one hand while keeping the weapon in the other, managing both without fumbling because the hand with the gun was steady in a way that told him this was not the first time she'd held one with intent. "Where?" "Not the main stairs. There's a secondary egress in the East Wing utility room. Connects to the subterranean passage that runs to the garage annex. Marcus knows it exists, but not the access code. I changed it 6 months ago and didn't update the security ledger." She was already at the door. He moved past her to the threshold, cleared the corridor in both directions, and they went. The utility room was 40 feet down the hall, a service space that housed maintenance equipment, and behind a panel of metal shelving, a door that most people who'd ever been in the estate had never noticed. Damien had had it installed 7 years ago by contractors who had never worked for him before or since. He had done it specifically because there are buildings a man lives in and buildings a man survives in, and after his mid-30s he'd stopped confusing the two. Elena moved fast for someone with a knife wound on her 3rd day. He could see the effort in the set of her jaw and the way her weight shifted slightly to favor the right side. But she kept pace and didn't mention it, and he didn't mention it either, because there was nothing useful either of them could do with that information in this corridor at this speed. He got the panel open, found the door, entered the 6-digit code by feel in the dark. The door opened into a narrow concrete passage, low-ceilinged, the air cold and stale. A single strip of emergency LED along the left wall, motion-activated, flickering on as they entered. He pulled the door shut behind them and heard the magnetic lock re-engage. They moved through the passage in silence. Damien in front, Elena directly behind him, the sound of their breathing the loudest thing in the enclosed space. Somewhere above and behind them, the firefight was still happening, muffled now through the concrete, reduced to a series of irregular vibrations that traveled through the walls and the floor. He counted steps out of habit. 112 to the annex junction. At 60, Elena said quietly, "Enzo will have been notified by now." "Yes." "If he knows the attack failed, he won't pull back. He'll accelerate." Damien kept moving. Enzo isn't the kind of man who retreats when a plan goes wrong. He finds the nearest available option and commits to it before the window closes. It's how he operated my father's organization, and it's how he operated mine. A pause. "It's why he's been dangerous from the beginning, and I was too close to see it." 80 steps. 90. "The warehouse," Elena said. "That's his next move. If I'm compromised or dead, the window for the seizure opens. He doesn't need the wedding cover anymore, so if there's chaos around the estate tonight, the organizational structure is already disrupted. He moves on the waterfront immediately." He reached the annex junction, a steel door, another code, so 4 digits this time. "Which means we need to be at that warehouse before his people are." He opened the door. The garage annex was dark and smelled like motor oil and cold rubber, the familiar smell of a space that existed below ground and held things waiting to be used. He found the light switch by memory. 4 vehicles, all black, all maintained in operational condition by Damien's standards, which meant they were serviced monthly regardless of use. He went to the second vehicle and was already reaching for the keys from the wall panel when he heard it. Footsteps above the annex ceiling, measured, unhurried, someone who knew where they were going. He turned and looked at Elena. She had heard it too. Her eyes moved to the ceiling and tracked the sound and then came back to him with the specific expression she wore when she was processing a threat assessment in real time. "The access road above the annex," she said. "Not inside, outside." He listened. She was right. The sound was the wrong timbre for inside the structure. It was someone walking the road surface directly above the annex roof, which was built slightly below grade level, which meant they were outside, not inside, which meant they hadn't found the passage. They were searching the exterior. He breathed out slowly through his nose. He threw her the keys to the third vehicle, a heavier model, More protection in the cabin. She caught them one-handed. He took the second set for himself. "Can you drive with the leg?" he said. "Yes." "The warehouse address is—" "I know it," she said. "I've processed the logistics invoices for that property for 4 years." Of course she did. "Take the North Service exit," he said. "Different route than the main gate. We split and meet at the warehouse in 20 minutes. If one of us doesn't arrive in 25, we don't plan for that scenario," she said flatly. He looked at her. "Elena, planning for that scenario divides attention we don't have." Her voice was practical and absolute and brooked nothing. 20 minutes. We're both there. That's the plan." He held her gaze for 1 second. Then he got in the vehicle. They went out through separate exits. The drive took 16 minutes. Damien pushed the engine through streets that were still wet and mostly empty in the pre-dawn hour, running routes in his head, checking mirrors, running through what he knew and what he needed. He called Reeves twice. The first call. The firefight at the estate was resolving. 3 of the attacking team were down. The rest had pulled back when the response proved heavier than expected. The 4th player, the inside man who'd freed Marcus, had not been identified. Marcus himself was gone. The second call, 3 minutes later. One of Reeves's men had found a body in the east basement stairwell, not one of the attackers. One of Damien's own security staff, a man named Garrett, who'd been on overnight detail, found at the base of the stairs with a broken neck. Marcus had not gone quietly. Marcus had gone through Garrett on his way out, and the calculation it took to do that, to kill a man you'd worked beside for 6 years in order to clear an exit, told Damien everything he needed to know about the version of Marcus that had been living behind the professional version for the past 4 months. He pulled up to the waterfront warehouse at 5:51 in the morning with the sky beginning to gray at the eastern edge, and his headlights cutting through the last of the rain. Elena was already there. She'd beaten him by 90 seconds and was standing at the side of her vehicle with the hard case in one hand and the 9mm in the other, watching the warehouse entrance with an expression of concentrated attention that reminded him, absurdly, of the way she looked at a spreadsheet with a discrepancy in it. The same quality of focus. The same absolute refusal to move until she understood what she was looking at. He pulled up beside her, got out. "One vehicle on the south side," she said without looking away from the building. "Got here before us. Could be Enzo's advance team setting up. Or it could be—" The side door of the warehouse opened. The man who stepped out was alone, and he was not Enzo, and he was not anyone from the Carano family. He was Marcus Hale, walking through the door of a warehouse that Damien owned, on the waterfront that Damien controlled, in the city that Damien had built his empire across, with the specific calm of a man who had spent 9 years learning exactly where everything was. He stopped when he saw them, 15 feet. The 3 of them in the gray pre-dawn, the water smell off the harbor reaching them on a thin, cold wind, the sound of the city beginning somewhere far back behind the industrial silence of the waterfront. Marcus had a weapon holstered but undrawn. His hands were visible. His jacket was torn at the collar, the aftermath of whatever had happened in the basement stairwell, the part that had cost Garrett his life. There was a cut above his left eye that was crusted and dried, and that he had paid no attention to. He looked at Damien, then at Elena, then back at Damien. "I didn't call them here," he said. "You called someone tonight. I called a number that was supposed to redirect, a dead contact." His jaw was tight. Someone had flipped the redirect. "I made a call I thought was going nowhere, and it went somewhere." He paused. "I'm not saying that to get sympathy. I'm saying it so you know the attack tonight wasn't me. I didn't want—" He stopped, started again. "I didn't want anyone at the estate hurt." "Garrett is dead," Damien said. The silence after that had a specific quality. Marcus closed his eyes for 1 second, just one, brief, controlled, and then opened them. Whatever he felt about Garrett, he put it somewhere interior and locked the door, and Damien watched him do it the way you watched someone do something that took physical effort. "I know," Marcus said. "He came at me. I didn't have a choice." "You always had a choice," Elena said. Marcus looked at her. There was a complicated expression on his face when he looked at her. Something that wasn't quite respect and wasn't quite guilt, and was something uncomfortable in between. "You're right," he said. Said it directly to her without qualification. "I did." Damien said, "Why are you here?" Because the Carano crew is 20 minutes behind me, and they're not coming alone, and if either of you are standing in this building when they arrive, you're both dead. He held Damien's gaze. And because there's something in this building you need to see before that happens. Damien looked at Marcus for a long count. 9 years. 9 years of reading that face, trusting that face, putting his life in the hands connected to that face, in rooms where his life required putting somewhere. All of that was in the balance right now, and he knew it, and Marcus knew it, and Elena, standing 2 feet to his left with a 9mm in her hand, knew it. "Show me," Damien said. Inside the warehouse was cold and smelled like oil and salt water, the way all waterfront storage smelled. Damien had been here a dozen times. He knew the layout, the main floor with its industrial shelving and cargo pallets, the secondary storage rooms along the west wall, the office mezzanine overlooking the floor from above. What he saw when Marcus led them through the side door and across the main floor was not something he knew. Against the north wall, stacked in military-spec crates that had not been here 72 hours ago, was the inventory that had been held in the secured secondary vault on the floor below. Someone, Marcus or whoever Marcus had been working with at the 4 months when access was being passed, had moved it up to the main floor. Ready for loading, ready for transport, already staged for a crew that was 20 minutes behind them. That wasn't what Marcus needed him to see. Marcus led them past the crates to the office mezzanine stairs, up to the elevated space overlooking the floor, and pointed at the desk in the corner of the office. Sitting behind the desk with his hands folded in front of him and his white hair catching the fluorescent light from the single working fixture overhead was Enzo Vescari. 71 years old, wearing a pressed shirt despite the hour. Looking at Damien across the desk with an expression that was composed and tired and entirely unsurprised. "I wondered which one of you would find it first," Enzo said. His voice was the same voice it had always been, the same cadence Damien had grown up with. "I expected Marcus, actually." His eyes moved to Elena, considered her with the appraising look of a man who has made a career of calculating the weight of things. "You must be Elena Cross. You're smaller than I expected for someone who caused this much trouble." "You've been here the whole time," Damien said. "Not a question." "I drove myself." Enzo gestured mildly at the chair across from the desk, the casual hospitality of a man who had decided the time for performance was over. "I've been coming to this building for 30 years, Damien. Before you were running it, before your father was running it. I know a secondary egress from this floor that Marcus doesn't know, and you don't know, and nobody knows, because the man who installed it died in 1987. He looked at his nephew. "Sit down." "I'll stand." "Of course you will." Something almost like a smile. "You always stood during difficult conversations. Your father sat. You stood. I always thought it was compensating for something." Damien felt the words register and do nothing. He was beyond the reach of that kind of provocation now, had moved through the register of things Enzo could do to him emotionally and come out the other side sometime in the last several hours. In a kitchen, and a basement, and a concrete passage, and a pre-dawn street, and now here, in a warehouse on his own waterfront, looking at the man who had stood at his father's funeral and chosen that moment to begin. "When did it start?" he said. Enzo unfolded his hands, folded them again, a deliberate gesture. "The specific arrangement with the Cabranos?" "March." "The broader decision?" He considered the ceiling for a moment. "Your father's funeral." There it was. 20 years, Damien said. "Not in motion for 20 years, but yes. The decision was made the night I stood at Antonio's coffin and looked at a 19-year-old boy who was about to inherit everything and understood that the boy was going to be better at this than I ever was." Enzo said it without venom. Factually. The assessment of a man who had evaluated the situation with complete honesty and made his plans accordingly. "I could have taken the organization that night. I had the loyalty of enough key people. But you were Antonio's son, and I had limits." A pause. "I waited to see if I was wrong about you." "You weren't," Elena said from beside Damien. Enzo looked at her. "No," he said. "I wasn't." His eyes stayed on her for a moment, which made the decision easier in the end. Not more comfortable, easier. "The Cabrano deal," Damien said. "After I'm gone, what were you getting? Money, Montenegro property, what else?" "Legitimacy." The word came out simply. "I'm 71 years old. The money is adequate. What I wanted, what I have wanted since your father died, and you took everything, and I took a salary and a title that meant nothing, was to be recognized as the architect, the person who actually built what exists." He spread his hands slightly. The Cabranos were offering credit, public, legal, documented credit in the restructured organization as a founding partner, not a lieutenant, not an uncle. His voice didn't waver. A name. The silence in the office mezzanine had a different quality from the silence below. Older, heavier. The weight of 20 years of patience and resentment sitting in the air between two men who were related by blood and separated by everything else. Damien looked at his uncle, at the white hair and the composed hands and the pressed shirt and the eyes that were the same gray-green as his own father's eyes and his own eyes in a mirror. He looked at all of it and felt the final movement of something settling into place. Not peace, not resolution, not forgiveness. Just clarity. The specific clarity of a man who has finally seen the complete picture and understands that some losses are not recoverable, they are simply acknowledged. "Marcus," he said without looking away from Enzo, "how long until the Carano crew arrives?" 15 minutes, maybe less. "And Ferris? The facility?" "I have 2 men there." Marcus's voice was careful, navigating carefully between the space of what he'd done and what he was doing now, aware of the impossibility of that navigation and doing it anyway. "I called them from the car. They'll hold Ferris and the documentation until your people relieve them." "My people who you just helped attack my estate." "Damien," Marcus's voice dropped. "I'm giving you everything I have. That's all I've got left to give you." Enzo watched this exchange with the quiet attention of a man watching a play he had partly written. "You should know," he said, addressing Damien, "that the Carano crew arriving in 15 minutes has orders that don't require my presence. Ciro doesn't need me in the room. He needs the inventory. Whether I'm standing next to it or sitting in a chair on a mezzanine is irrelevant to his operation." "Then why are you still here?" Damien said. A pause. Longer than any pause Enzo had taken yet. "Because I wanted to see you," he said. Said it quietly, and whatever else was in that statement, whatever architecture of justification and calculation had been built up over 20 years, there was also something in it that was simply true. "I wanted to see your face when you understood the complete picture. I didn't want to vanish to Montenegro without—" He stopped, looked at his folded hands. "I am aware that this doesn't change what I did." "No," Damien said. "It doesn't." He looked at Marcus. Marcus looked back at him, said nothing. Because Marcus had been in this business long enough to know that some moments resolved themselves through silence, and this was one of them. Damien's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. Reeves, perimeter at warehouse, 4 vehicles inbound, ETA 8 minutes, 8 minutes. He looked at Elena. She was watching him with those steady dark eyes, the hard case under one arm, and the weapon in her hand, and she was not telling him what to do or how to feel or what the calculation was. She was simply present, available, solid in the particular way she was always solid, the way furniture was solid, the way load-bearing walls were solid, the thing that held shape under pressure when everything decorative around it shifted. He made the decision in the space between one breath and the next. "Marcus," he said, "you're going to help me take the Carano crew when they come through that door. Whatever that costs you with them, that's your cost to pay." Marcus exhaled through his nose. "I know." "If you run, I'm not running," said flatly. "No performance in it." "Where do you want me?" Damien looked at the floor plan of the warehouse below them, the main entrance, the west wall access, the loading bays on the south side. 8 minutes to position. 8 minutes to turn a building full of staged inventory into something that functioned as a kill box for the people who'd come to take it. He turned to Elena. "Mezzanine," he said. "High position, sight lines over the main floor. You do not come down regardless of what you hear." She started to say something. "Elena." His voice was quiet and absolute. "Please." She looked at him for a moment with that same open expression she'd had in the room before he'd left. The one that lasted 1 second before the professional composure reclaimed it. This time it lasted slightly longer. "Don't get shot," she said. He moved toward the mezzanine stairs. Behind him, from the desk, Enzo said, "Damien." He stopped. did not turn. "What I built," Enzo said. His voice was old now, not weak, old. The specific age that comes from a decision finally landing in full. Everything before your father died. The port infrastructure, the eastern supply chains, the political connections in this city that made the Viscari name mean something before you were born. That was mine. I want you to know I know that. Damien stood at the top of the mezzanine stairs with one hand on the railing. "I know it too," he said. Then he went down toward the warehouse floor, and the 8 minutes that were going to determine everything, moving into the dark between the industrial shelving as the sound of vehicles on wet pavement reached him from outside the south wall, getting closer, getting louder. And somewhere above him, Elena Cross was settling into position at the mezzanine rail with a 9mm and 4 years of everything she'd carried in silence. The first vehicle came through the south loading bay doors at 6:04 in the morning. Not through the doors, through them. The rolling steel panels buckled inward under the weight of a truck that hadn't slowed, the sound enormous in the enclosed space. Metal shrieking against concrete as the truck pushed through and stopped with its front end inside the warehouse and its headlights blazing white across the main floor. The second vehicle came through the personnel entrance on the west wall 30 seconds later, 4 men moving fast through the opening in a tactical stack that told Damien these were not warehouse workers or logistics contractors. These were people who had done this before. He was already behind the second row of industrial shelving when the lights hit the floor. Marcus was on the opposite side of the building, east wall, positioned behind a pallet stack with sight lines to the main entrance. They had spent 6 minutes arranging themselves in the dark and had not spoken much during those 6 minutes because the specifics of the tactical problem didn't require conversation and the other things that existed between them didn't have a shape that language could hold right now. Reeves and 2 of his men had come in through the subterranean entrance that connected to the harborside service passage, a route that Marcus hadn't known about, that Elena had pulled from the original building schematics on the drive during the passage walk from the estate. 3 against however many were in those vehicles. 4, if you counted Marcus, which Damien hadn't decided yet and was going to have to decide very quickly. The men from the west entrance fanned out. Damien watched them through a gap in the shelving, tracking the movement, reading the formation. Professional. Coordinated. Someone had briefed them on the building layout, which meant Marcus's access had been more thorough than Marcus had admitted or wanted to admit. A voice from near the truck. Male, accented, not heavily, but enough to place. Eastern European. The particular flatness that came from Russian or Ukrainian as a first language underneath the English. "Clear the floor first. Crates go out once we confirm." Damien recognized the voice. Not personally, he'd never met the man, but from Elena's files. She had a voice recording from the courier's phone recovered at Kellner Freight Yard, a brief 14-second clip of a call placed 90 minutes before she'd been cut. The voice on that recording had the same quality, flat, precise, the economy of a man who said exactly what he meant and nothing decorative. Vadim. Ciro Carano's operational contractor. Based out of a port city on the Adriatic, moved between jurisdictions, appeared in 3 separate intelligence files Elena had cross-referenced and annotated in the margins in her small, precise handwriting. A man who did not come to a job like this without bringing enough people to finish it cleanly. Damien counted 4 from the truck as they moved out onto the floor. 4 from the west entrance. The second truck hadn't come in yet. It was still outside, which meant it was either a transport vehicle for the crates or a reserve. He assumed reserve. 8 men visible. More possible. He looked up at the mezzanine. He couldn't see Elena from his position, but he knew she was there. He knew exactly where she was standing because he'd placed her there himself, and she was not a person who moved from an assigned position without reason. He thought about telling himself not to think about her. Decided that was a waste of energy. She was there, she was armed, she knew how to use it. That was the complete set of relevant facts. He pulled his radio to his lips. Clicked it twice. The signal they'd arranged with Reeves. 2 clicks meant ready. He waited. Reeves came back with 3 clicks. Positioned. Damien stood up from behind the shelving and shot the nearest man in the shoulder before anyone on the floor had finished processing the fact that he was standing there. The man went down. The sound of the shot in the enclosed space was extraordinary. It compressed the air, bounced off every hard surface, erased all other noise for a full second. In that second, Reeves's team came through the harbor side entrance on the east end of the main floor, and Marcus, Damien saw it from his peripheral vision, filed it, processed it. Marcus came out from behind the east pallet stack with his weapon up. 4 counts became 3. The floor reorganized itself into chaos. It lasted 4 minutes. 4 minutes was a long time in that context. Longer than it sounded from the outside. Shorter than it felt from the inside. Damien moved between the shelving rows, keeping metal between himself and the angles of fire, doing the mathematics of cover and exposure the way his body had learned to do it in the years before he'd been the kind of man who had enough people between himself and the shooting to stay clean. He was not that man tonight. Tonight he was what he'd been at 23, before the Empire, before the suits and the penthouse, and the carefully maintained distance between himself and the consequences of the decisions he made. A man came around the end of a shelving row, and Damien hit him in the chest twice before the man's weapon cleared its holster. He kept moving. Another man, coming from the direction of the truck, with his weapon already leveled. Damien went sideways into the shelving, metal edge catching his ribs hard enough to knock the breath out of him, and fired from a position that was not correct and not stable, and produced a result that was not clean but was sufficient. He came up against the base of the north wall with his back to the crates, and took 2 seconds to breathe and assess. His side ached where the shelving had caught him. Not broken, he decided, but the kind of bruise that was going to announce itself for the next several days. He could hear the fight still moving on the floor. Reeves's voice, controlled and brief. The sounds of men in close quarters doing what men in close quarters did. Then from above, 1 shot from the mezzanine. Single, clean, the report distinct from the heavier sounds below. He looked up. Elena's position at the rail. He couldn't see the outcome from where he was, but he heard, in the particular way that silence replaced a specific kind of motion, that the outcome had been definitive. 30 seconds later, it was over. The warehouse was very quiet. The truck's engine was still running, a low idle that vibrated through the concrete floor. One of the overhead lights had been shot out during the exchange, and the resulting asymmetry of illumination gave the main floor a strange, divided quality, half in fluorescent white, half in the shadow the dead light left behind. Reeves was on the east side with both his men still standing. Marcus was near the west entrance, blood on his left forearm where something had caught him, a graze, not deep, but producing with the indifference that wounds had about their own severity. One of Ciro Carano's men was on the ground not moving. The others were secured, zip-tied, sitting against the base of the truck with expressions that ranged from fury to resignation. Vadim was on his knees near the center of the floor with his hands on his head. He did not look furious or resigned. He looked like a man doing the calculation of what came next and not finding any version of it that he preferred. Damien walked out from the north wall. His ribs announced themselves with each step. He looked at the floor, at the men against the truck, at Reeves, at Marcus, at Vadim on his knees, and then he looked up at the mezzanine. Elena was at the rail, both hands on the metal, weapon holstered, looking down at him. In the asymmetric light, her face was half shadow, and the expression on it was the one he'd been collecting all night. The professional composure with something underneath it that the composure was working hard to contain. She was upright. She was unhurt. He looked at her for 2 seconds and then looked at Vadim. "Where is Ciro Carano?" he said. Vadim said nothing. "He's not here." Damien crouched to Vadim's eye level. "That means he sent you and stayed clear, which means he expected this to be clean, and he's currently waiting for confirmation that it was." He held the man's gaze. "When that confirmation doesn't come, he runs. And when he runs, this becomes the kind of problem that takes years to resolve." He paused. "Tell me where he is, and I resolve it tonight." Vadim looked at him with flat, professional eyes. "You think I know where he is? You're his operational contractor. You know within 300 meters. A pause. Vadim's jaw moved once, a small chewing motion that meant he was working through his own calculation. "The Harbor Hotel. North Tower, 14th floor. He keeps it under a company name. Seaverport Holdings." He said it without visible internal conflict, which told Damien either that Vadim had made peace with this quickly, or that he'd been prepared to offer it at some point as a negotiating chip, and this was simply sooner than he'd planned. "He has 2 men with him. Security, not operations." Damien stood, looked at Reeves. "North Tower, Harbridge Hotel. You have 40 minutes before he gets nervous enough to move. Reeves was already moving. Understood. Damien walked to the mezzanine stairs. He climbed them slowly. His ribs were making themselves known with more specificity now, and the adrenaline that had been carrying him for the last 4 minutes was beginning its particular withdrawal, leaving behind a heaviness in the muscles and a ringing in the ears and the specific clarity of a body that has done something extreme and is beginning to tabulate the cost. Elena met him at the top of the stairs. She looked at his side before she looked at his face, the slight favoring of his right side, the way he'd taken the last 3 steps with his left hand on the railing. "Ribs," he said. "Broken?" "Bruised." She looked at his face then. He looked at hers. They were standing at the top of a mezzanine staircase in a warehouse on a waterfront at 6 in the morning, both of them damaged in different ways and to different degrees. And the situation had a quality of arrival, of having moved through something large and come out somewhere that had not existed before. "It's done," she said. Not a question. "Almost." He looked past her toward the desk where Enzo was still sitting. "Almost." He walked past her into the office space. Enzo had not moved from the chair. He had the particular stillness of a man who had decided some time ago that movement was no longer the point. He watched Damien cross the office toward him, and his hands remained folded on the desk, and his face remained composed in that specific way that Damien now understood was not serenity, but its precise imitation, a performance of dignity maintained so long it had become inseparable from the man performing it. Damien sat in the chair across the desk, the same chair Enzo had gestured toward earlier and Damien had refused. He sat in it now because refusing to sit was a performance of its own, and he was finished performing. They looked at each other across the desk. "Ciro Carano is being collected from the Harbridge Hotel," Damien said. "The documentation Ferris was holding is being imaged and secured. The men who came for the warehouse are detained or down." He said it factually, without heat. "The conspiracy is over." Enzo nodded once. A small, precise movement. "I assumed it would resolve this way when I saw you come through the door." A pause. "I'm not saying that as criticism. You were always going to be the ending of any scenario that began with someone trying to remove you." Something moved across his face. Not pride, not exactly. Something more complicated and less comfortable. "Your father would have been—" "Don't," Damien said. Enzo stopped. "Don't bring him into it. You made your decision the night we buried him, and you've been living it for 20 years. What he would or wouldn't have been is not a resource you get to use anymore." Enzo looked at his hands. The composure was still there, but underneath it now, visible in the quality of his breathing, slightly shallower than before, the breath of an old man at the end of a very long project, was something that was simply tiredness, not guilt. Damien looked at his uncle and understood with a clarity that surprised him that Enzo was not a man who experienced guilt in the conventional sense. He was a man who made calculations and lived with the outcomes of calculations, and what he was experiencing now was the specific fatigue of a calculation that had run its full course and produced a result he had considered possible all along. "What happens now?" Enzo said. Damien looked at him, at the white hair, at the gray-green eyes that were his father's eyes, that were his own eyes, at 71 years of patience and ambition, and the particular damage that patience married to ambition created in a human being over time. "Montenegro," Damien said. "The property under your wife's maiden name. You go there and you stay there and you don't come back to this city or make contact with anyone connected to this organization or the Carano family." He held his uncle's gaze. "If you do, the full documentation of the conspiracy goes to every jurisdiction with an interest in it, including the 2 federal agencies who have been building a case against the Carano family for the last 4 years. Enzo looked at him for a long moment. "That's it. That's it. You're letting me go." "I'm letting you be somewhere else," Damien said. "Those are not the same thing." Another moment. Enzo looked at his hands again. Then he stood, slowly, with the careful deliberateness of a man whose body had been in a chair for too long and knew it. He straightened his shirt, smoothed his jacket, small, habitual gestures of personal maintenance that belonged to the performance of dignity, but that were also simply what he did, what he had always done, the rituals of a man who had never stopped believing in the importance of how he appeared. He looked at Damien one final time. "For what it's worth," he said. It's not, Damien said. Said it quietly, without anger and without cruelty, just factually. Go. Enzo walked to the mezzanine stairs. Damien watched him go without moving from the chair. He heard the footsteps descend, heard them cross the warehouse floor below, heard the personnel entrance open and close. Then there was nothing but the idling truck engine and the quiet movements of men doing the work of aftermath. He sat in the chair for a moment with his hands on the desk in front of him, palms down on the surface, feeling the particular weight of an ending. Elena came and stood in the office doorway. She didn't say anything. She looked at where Enzo had been sitting and then at Damien's hands on the desk and then at his face. And whatever she read there she accepted without comment. She leaned against the door frame with her injured leg slightly offset, the weight carried by the right side, the hard case on the floor beside her because she'd set it down at some point and he hadn't noticed when. Ciro Carano, she said eventually. Reeves will handle it. And Ferris. The documentation gets locked into a secured account that releases automatically if anything happens to either of us. Ferris stops being a threat the moment he understands that killing me makes things worse for him, not better. He paused. I'll have the attorney make that clear to him in language he can't misread. She nodded. Processing, running the remaining variables the way she always ran variables, quietly, completely, without showing the work on her face. Marcus, she said, that one sat in the air differently from the others. Damien looked at his hands on the desk. He came out on the floor tonight, he said. He didn't have to. He had an exit. He chose to stand. That doesn't undo the 4 months. No. He looked up at her. It doesn't, but it's a data point. I don't know yet what I do with Marcus. I know what I can't do, which is put him back where he was. And I know what I won't do, which is... He stopped. Decided not to finish that particular sentence. I'll figure out Marcus. She accepted that, set it aside. The way she set things aside that were resolved to the degree they were going to be resolved right now and didn't benefit from further processing. What do we do today? She said. He looked at her. We call the wedding coordinator and cancel 200 reservations. We notify the stakeholders with a story that is true enough to satisfy and vague enough to not create secondary problems. We deal with the Carano political fallout through the right intermediaries. He paused. And we get your leg properly looked at by someone with an actual medical degree. I've been managing... Elena, he said her name with a flatness that was not unkind. You stitched your own wound with craft store thread on a bathroom floor after 3 days. She looked at him for a moment. Then something happened at the corner of her mouth. Small, brief, the ghost of an expression that arrived and departed before it fully formed. The thread was a medical grade. I ordered it online. He looked at her. From the same budget that covered the rest of the apartment. The almost expression came back, stayed slightly longer this time. We should go, she said. He stood. His ribs told him what they thought about that. He stood anyway. They went down the mezzanine stairs together. Him first, one hand on the rail, and her behind him. And at the bottom of the stairs she stopped to pick up the hard case she'd left on the main floor, and when she straightened up she was standing very close to him, closer than their professional distance had ever been, because the mezzanine staircase was narrow and the warehouse floor was wide, and the step from one to the other had left no gap between them. He didn't move back. Neither did she. They were standing in a warehouse at 6 in the morning, with blood on the floor and the engine of a truck. Someone had driven through a steel door still idling 20 feet away. And Damien Vescari looked at Elena Cross at this distance, at the exhaustion around her eyes, and the steadiness of those eyes regardless of the exhaustion, at the dried blood on the cuff of her borrowed jacket from a wound she'd managed alone for 3 days rather than ask for help, at the woman who had spent 4 years being the most important person in his organization while occupying the smallest possible space within it, and felt something he'd been feeling since the bathroom on Kellner Street resolve itself into something with a name. He did not say the name out loud. He wasn't that man, wasn't built for that kind of declaration. And she wasn't that woman, wasn't built to receive it easily. And both of those things were true, and neither of them required fixing tonight. What he said was, "You're moving out of Kellner Street." She looked at him steadily. "You said that." "I'm saying it again." I heard you the first time. And a pause, the truck idling, the gray morning coming through the gap in the south loading bay doors, the real dawn now, not the pre-dawn gray, but actual light beginning at the edge of the sky outside. And, she said carefully, I'm not moving into the estate. I have 6 other properties in this city. I'm aware. I manage the insurance on all of them. Then pick one. She looked at him. The professional composure was fully intact, had been throughout this conversation, and would remain intact because that was simply who she was. And he understood now that it was not distance, was never distance, was the structure she'd built to carry the weight of everything she carried, because without structure, the weight would have broken her years ago. The composure was not a wall. It was load-bearing. Salary adjustment as well, she said. Substantial. Define substantial. Whatever number you would have asked for if you'd ever allowed yourself to ask. Something shifted behind her eyes. Small. Significant. That's not a number. No, he said. It's not. I'll have the attorney draft something, and you'll tell me what's wrong with it. He paused. You'll tell me what's wrong with it thoroughly and in writing, and I will accept every correction. That's how it works from now on. She looked at him for a long moment. In the growing light from the bay doors, the warehouse had changed character. The violence of an hour ago receding into the ordinary industrial ugliness of the space itself. The shelving and the concrete and the cold air off the harbor. The bodies had been moved. Reeves's men were working quietly at the edges. The truck's engine finally coughed and went silent, someone having shut it down, and in the quiet that followed she said, You didn't know where I lived. No? 4 years. I know. She looked at the floor for a moment, then back at him. I'm not saying that as accusation. I'm saying it as a fact that needs to be acknowledged before we proceed with whatever this is, whatever arrangement we're building. She held his gaze. I don't need you to feel guilty about it indefinitely. I need you to understand that I was not invisible because I was unimportant. I was invisible because I allowed it, because invisibility was operationally useful, and because... She stopped. A brief pause that was unlike her usual calculated pauses, less controlled, more genuine, because it was easier than the alternative. What was the alternative? He said. She looked at him with those direct dark eyes. This, she said, this conversation, in whatever form it might have taken, earlier than it did. He understood what she was saying. She had made herself small because being seen came with costs she hadn't been ready to absorb. And she had continued making herself small until the circumstances became so large that smallness was no longer possible. He understood it because he had done the same thing with different materials, had hidden himself inside the architecture of the empire, the decisions, the forward motion of the enterprise, until a woman on a bathroom floor at the end of 3 days of managing the impossible alone had made hiding feel like a waste of what time remained. The alternative is available, he said, if you want it. She held his gaze. The morning light kept coming through the bay doors, spreading across the concrete floor between them and around them and past them into the back of the warehouse where the crates sat waiting for a crew that wasn't coming. I'll look at the properties, she said. It was not a declaration. It was not a romantic resolution. It was Elena Cross accepting a concrete step toward a concrete change with the measured precision she brought to every decision that mattered to her, and it was the most honest thing he'd heard in 4 years. Good, he said. They walked out of the warehouse together, through the south bay doors and into the morning. The sky was fully light now, the sun not yet visible, but its evidence everywhere. The clouds lit from below, the harbor water catching it, the wet streets that ran away from the waterfront into the city reflecting it back in long, pale lines. The air was cold and smelled like salt and rain and the city waking up, that specific smell of an urban morning that was simultaneously beautiful and entirely indifferent to the previous night. Elena stopped at the vehicles, looked at the one she'd driven, looked at him. I'll follow you, she said. To the estate. To get the leg looked at. A pause. And then I need to sleep. A real amount. Agreed. And then we have a great deal of work to do. We do. She looked at the city for a moment. At the harbor and the light and the morning that had arrived despite everything the night had tried to prevent. Then she looked at him with an expression that was neither professional nor guarded, that was simply present, simply hers. The expression of a woman standing in the ordinary, extraordinary fact of still being alive. "When I was on the bathroom floor," she said, "on the second night, I calculated the probability that any of this resolved in a way that didn't end with both of us dead or destroyed." She paused. The number was not encouraging. "What was it?" 17%, said without drama. "Based on the variables I could account for." "And the variables you couldn't?" She looked at him. "You," she said simply. "I couldn't account for how fast you'd move once you understood the complete picture. I've worked with you for 4 years, and I still underestimated that." A brief pause. "I won't again." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "You told me the alternative probability was 17%, and you still went to Kellner Freight Yard alone at night to take a case from a courier." "Yes." "Why?" She held his gaze and said the truest thing either of them had said in the whole long night. "Because 17% was better than 0. He had no answer for that. Not because there wasn't one, but because it didn't need one. It was complete by itself. The logic of a person who looked at an impossible situation and walked toward it anyway, because walking toward it was the only thing that created any probability at all of something worth walking toward. He got in his vehicle. She got in hers. They drove back through the city in the morning light, not side by side, but in the same direction, taking different routes that converged eventually at the same destination, the way the whole night had worked, 2 people moving through the same darkness by different paths, and arriving together at whatever came next. At the estate, Mrs. Reyes had coffee ready without being asked. She took one look at Elena's leg and one look at Damien's ribs, and her expression did the specific thing it did. The brief compression of feeling that meant she had already begun managing the situation, and feeling about it was a secondary task. Dr. Farrow arrived at 8 o'clock. He was thorough and professional and asked very few questions, which was why Damien had trusted him with the estate's medical needs for 11 years. A trust that had survived the night intact, unlike so many others. Elena's wound needed 2 stitches replaced and proper antibiotic treatment, and the kind of rest that actually meant rest, which the doctor communicated directly and without softening. She accepted the information with her usual precision and then negotiated the rest requirement from 3 days to 2, which the doctor declined, and settled at 2.5, which he accepted with the expression of a man who recognized the specific quality of an immovable object. Damien's ribs were 2 of them, bruised, not broken, which he had correctly self-diagnosed. He was told not to take deep breaths unnecessarily, which was approximately the most useless medical instruction he had ever received, and taped and sent on his way. The wedding cancellations went out at 9. His attorney drafted the communications, private, specific, using the particular coded language that existed within these circles for situations requiring discretion. The responses came back throughout the morning, brief, understanding, the responses of people who operated in a world where plans changed violently and rapidly, and you learned to receive that information without demanding explanations you knew you wouldn't get. Sofia Carano called at 9:47. He didn't answer. His attorney would handle that conversation in language that was legal and definitive, and that protected Damien's exposure while giving her family exactly enough to understand that the specific plan involving his death had been documented in full. That documentation was now in a secured position that would be released in the event of any escalation. It was not a negotiation, it was an architecture of mutually assured consequences, which was the only language the Carano family had ever genuinely understood. Ciro Carano was collected from the Harbridge Hotel at 6:42 in the morning by Reeves and his men. He was detained, not harmed, and informed of the documentation in terms similar to what his sister had been informed of, the balance of consequences, and the specific geometry of what his future looked like if he chose escalation over withdrawal. He was given 12 hours to communicate to his organization's leadership that the alliance with Enzo Vescari was dissolved, the waterfront operation was abandoned, and any further move against Damien or anyone associated with him would trigger an immediate and complete release of 6 months of conspiracy documentation to the relevant authorities. He took 11 of those 12 hours and then communicated. Dr. Arnaud Ferris was contacted by Damien's attorney at 10 in the morning. The conversation was brief and entirely about numbers, not threats, not confrontations, just the arithmetic of what the imaged documentation of 2 prior transactions was worth, versus what it cost Ferris to maintain the current silence permanently. The number required to maintain the silence was not small. It was also not, Damien reflected, disproportionate to the cost of not having managed this earlier and more honestly, which was a lesson he was adding to the long list of lessons the night had produced. Marcus Hale was still in the east basement. Damien went to him at noon alone. He brought 2 coffees, which was either an act of specific human consideration or a habit so deep it operated below decision-making, and he sat across from Marcus in the same configuration as the kitchen conversation, but in better light with less urgency. Marcus wrapped both hands around the coffee cup and said nothing. "You killed Garrett," Damien said. "Yes. That doesn't get resolved. That doesn't get explained or contextualized or balanced against anything else." Damien held his gaze. "That's the weight you carry. I'm not going to tell you what to do with it." Marcus looked at the coffee cup. The cut above his eye had been cleaned and closed with 2 strips of medical tape. His forearm was bandaged. He looked like a man at the end of something, which was what he was. "What are you doing with me? You're going to give my attorney a complete account of every piece of information you passed, every contact you made, every access you provided over the past 4 months. Complete. Including the things that make you look worst." Damien paused. "Then you're going to disappear. Not violently, just, you're not going to be in this city or this organization anymore. You're going to go somewhere that is not here, and you're going to build something that is not this." Marcus looked up. "That's it. That's it. Why?" Damien thought about Elena on the bathroom floor, choosing the 17% over the 0. He thought about what that kind of calculation cost and what it produced and what it said about the nature of people who made it. "Because you came out on that floor tonight," he said, "and because 9 years is 9 years, and I don't do things for clean reasons. I do them for true ones." He stood. "The debrief starts this afternoon." He left Marcus with the coffee. 3 days later, Elena moved into the property on Callaway Street. It was not the largest of the 6 options, not the most impressive, not the one that made the most obvious statement about the change in her circumstances. It was the one with a second bedroom she could use as an office and a window in the main room that faced east, which she had mentioned once in passing in a conversation 6 months ago that Damien had not remembered at the time and had remembered 3 days ago when reviewing the property descriptions, and he had marked it without comment and let her choose. She chose it. He drove her there on a Tuesday morning, which was not an arrangement that had been discussed explicitly, but had arrived naturally from the fact that she had no car, and the moving company required someone present at the address. And he was the person who knew the address, and she was the person moving there. And the logic was simple. They stood in the empty main room after the movers left. The east window was doing what he'd known it would do, filling the room with a quality of light that was different from the flat overhead illumination of the rest of the space, something warmer and more specific. Elena stood in the middle of it and looked around at the empty room with the focused expression she brought to assessments. "It's good," she said. "It is." She looked at the window. "You remembered the window." He said nothing, which was its own answer. She looked at him with those dark, direct eyes, the full professional composure present, and also, underneath it, the thing that had been underneath it for 4 years and longer, the intelligence and the stubbornness and the specific quality of care that she administered with the same precision she applied to everything, carefully, without waste, in the exact amount that the situation required, and not a unit more. "I start back Monday," she said. "Tuesday," he said. "Take the extra day." "I don't need—" "Elena." A pause. The east light in the room. "Tuesday," she said. They didn't say anything else for a moment. The room was quiet, in the way that rooms were quiet when they were empty and about to stop being empty, on the edge of becoming what they would be. Outside the east window, the city moved through its ordinary Tuesday, the sounds of traffic and voices, and the specific urban hum of 10,000 simultaneous ordinary lives, all of them indifferent to the night that had passed, and the things that had been lost and found and dismantled and rebuilt within it. Damien looked at Elena Cross standing in the light of the window she had been given without asking for it, and thought about 17% and about the weight of everything she'd carried in silence, and about the fact that the strongest person he had ever encountered in 20 years of a world built on the premise that strength was visible and loud and armed, had been the woman at the desk outside his office who wrote her notes in small, precise handwriting and pressed her thumbnail to her bottom lip when she was solving something and had never once asked him for a single thing. He thought about asking something now, something larger than a property or a salary or a Tuesday instead of a Monday. He looked at the room, at the light, at her. "I'll leave you to settle in," he said. She nodded once, walked him to the door. Her leg barely showed in her stride now. She moved with almost her full previous economy of motion, the kind of recovery that came from being the type of person who simply did not allow things to persist in being worse than they had to be. At the door, she said, "Damien?" He turned. She looked at him with the expression that lasted longer now than it used to, the one without the professional layer over it, the one that was simply her. "Thank you," she said. "For Kellner Street." He held her gaze. "You should never have needed to be found." She looked at him steadily. "No," she said. "But you came." He left. He drove back through the city toward the estate with the morning around him and the empire intact and the long work of rebuilding something on the foundation that remained, removing the corruption from the structure the way you removed rot from a building, carefully, without taking more than necessary, leaving what was sound and replacing what wasn't with something built to last. He thought about his father, about Enzo, about Marcus, about the specific geometry of loyalty and what it cost and what it produced, and how he had spent 20 years measuring it wrong, looking for it in the places where it announced itself, and missing it entirely in the place it had simply been doing its work in silence. He thought about Tuesday. He drove through the city in the ordinary morning light, neither restored to what he'd been before, nor destroyed by what the night had cost. Changed, which was the only honest word, and moving forward, which was the only honest direction, in the company of a truth he'd earned the hard way and intended not to waste.